Hi everyone. Today I've got 3 chilling horror stories to share, full of suspense, twists, and eerie moments that will keep you hooked. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Let me know which story gave you the biggest scare and share your feedback for future content. Let's dive in. Ethan always had a taste for adventure, though his recent fascination with urban exploration was new. When he stumbled upon an article about the abandoned Grant Manor, a sprawling estate long forgotten on the outskirts of town, he couldn't resist. Rumors of unexplained disappearances and eerie noises drew him in, despite warnings from locals to stay away. On a crisp autumn evening, Ethan arrived at the estate, the overgrown path crunching beneath his boots. The house loomed in the moonlight, its windows dark, its facade cracked and decayed. Yet, even in its disrepair, it carried an undeniable allure, as though it were alive, waiting for him to step inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air thickened, and the silence became oppressive. Dust hung in the still air, and his flashlight cast long, flickering shadows across the ornate yet decayed furniture. The house smelled of damp wood and mildew, but beneath it lingered something sour and metallic. Ethan paused in the grand foyer, his gaze fixed on the towering spiral staircase. That's when he heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, drifting from deeper within the house. "Hello?" he called, his voice swallowed by the shadows. No response. He shook off the unease and pressed on. As he explored, every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified. Every shadow seemed to move when he wasn't looking. But then he heard it again, a whisper, clearer this time. "Leave!" it urged. Ethan froze. The voice wasn't coming from any direction he could pinpoint. It was everywhere, above, below, around him, and within him. Heart pounding, he turned back toward the entrance, but as his flashlight swept across the room, he saw something that made his breath catch. The front door, which he'd left ajar, was now shut. Before he could move, the whisper returned, louder and more insistent. "Why did you come?" And then the door slammed. Cliffhanger. Ethan turned back to the darkness, realizing he was no longer alone. Ethan's heart pounded as the door rattled in its frame, the echo fading into the vast emptiness of the house. He lunged for the handle, twisting it desperately, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, though he'd never touched a key. "Stay calm," he whispered to himself, backing away. His voice sounded strange in the cavernous room, like it didn't belong to him anymore. Then the whispers returned, soft and disjointed, like fragments of a dream. They came from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. "Too late. You shouldn't have come." "Who's there?" Ethan shouted, spinning around, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The air felt heavier now, pressing against his chest like unseen hands. He could feel something watching him, its gaze cold and unrelenting. The house itself seemed to breathe, the faint sound of wood groaning like an exhalation. Ethan stumbled into the next room, a cavernous living area. The fireplace loomed at the far end, its bricks blackened with soot. Above it hung a grand mirror, its surface cracked and warped. As Ethan approached, he caught a glimpse of his reflection, or what he thought was his reflection. But the face staring back wasn't his. It was gaunt, hollow-eyed, its lips moving soundlessly. Ethan stumbled back, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the walls. The whispers surged again, now forming coherent words. "Help us. Trapped. Beneath." Ethan's knees buckled, and he grasped a nearby chair for support. The voice in the mirror was pleading, but beneath it, a darker tone emerged, something cruel and hungry. "We warned you," it growled. "Now, you'll never leave." The fireplace roared to life without warning, flames crackling and illuminating the room in a sinister orange glow. The mirror warped further, its surface rippling like water. Ethan watched, frozen, as hands began to push against the glass from the other side, clawing and smearing the cracks with black oozing streaks. Cliffhanger, the hands pressed harder, and the mirror began to splinter. A low, guttural laugh erupted from the flames. Something was coming through. Ethan stumbled back as the mirror cracked open like a fragile shell, shards of glass cascading to the floor. Behind the fractured surface was not a reflection, but a void, dark, endless, and pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. The hands clawing from within the mirror became clearer now, gnarled and twisted, their flesh hanging in tatters. A face began to emerge, its eyes sunken, its mouth stretched wide in a soundless scream. "Don't look away," the guttural voice from the flames growled, its heat pushing Ethan toward the broken mirror. "They want you to run. Don't give them the satisfaction." Ethan's legs trembled, but he couldn't move. His flashlight flickered, its weak beam illuminating grotesque figures slithering within the void. They whispered in unison, their voices like dead leaves scraping against stone. "Join us. Feel what we feel. See what we see." Suddenly, the room shifted. The walls groaned, the ceiling seemed to stretch higher, and the door he'd entered through was gone. The house was alive, reshaping itself around him. "Enough!" Ethan screamed, trying to drown out the voices. He swung the flashlight toward the mirror, hurling it with all his strength. The impact shattered the remaining glass, and the void behind it erupted in a gust of cold wind that extinguished the fire. The room plunged into darkness, except for a faint, ghostly glow emanating from the shattered frame. Ethan thought he'd won until the floor beneath him began to quake. Cracks spread like veins, and from the depths, he heard a sound he'd only heard in his nightmares. A deep, resonating heartbeat. "Down here!" the voices hissed. "This is where it begins." A blackened hand shot out from the cracks, grabbing Ethan's ankle with an iron grip. He screamed, clawing at the floor, but the hand was impossibly strong, dragging him toward the gaping fissure. Cliffhanger. As Ethan's fingers slipped on the splintered wood, a pair of glowing, inhuman eyes opened in the void beneath him. Whatever lay below was awake, and it was waiting for him. Ethan clawed at the floor, splinters digging into his fingertips, but the hand dragging him down was relentless. The glowing eyes in the void below were fixed on him, their stare cold and ancient. "No!" Ethan shouted, kicking at the hand with all his might. His heel connected, and for a brief moment, the grip loosened. He scrambled backward, gasping for breath. The fissure beneath him pulsed like a beating heart, releasing a bone-chilling cold. Ethan's flashlight had rolled into the darkness, leaving only the faint glow from the cracks to guide him. "I need to get out," he muttered, his voice trembling. But there was no way out. Every door had vanished, and the walls now seemed miles apart. The house was infinite, a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. Suddenly, the floorboards beneath Ethan's feet began to shift, folding and warping as though alive. He stumbled, landing hard, and the cracks in the wood spread wider. From within the void, the whispers grew louder, now interspersed with low, guttural laughter. "Come closer," a voice purred, silky and menacing. "You're almost there." Ethan stood, his legs shaking, and turned toward the sound. A staircase he hadn't noticed before spiraled down into the darkness. The steps seemed carved from bone, slick with some dark, glistening substance. Against his better judgment, he approached. The air grew colder with each step he descended, the whispers now a cacophony of pain and sorrow. At the bottom, Ethan found himself in a cavernous room lined with shelves. On each shelf sat a collection of strange objects, cracked pocket watches, broken mirrors, rusted keys, all emanating a faint, ghostly glow. In the center of the room stood a figure cloaked in shadows, its form tall and indistinct. "You've come far," it said, its voice like gravel grinding against steel. "But the house isn't done with you yet." The figure extended a hand, and Ethan's body seized as though bound by invisible chains. His feet lifted off the ground, and he was drawn closer to the shadowy figure, its face still hidden in darkness. "You're part of it now," the figure whispered. "Part of us." Cliffhanger. The figure stepped forward, revealing its face. It was Ethan's own, twisted into a mask of terror, its lips curling into a sinister smile. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he stared into his own distorted face. The shadowy figure, his doppelganger, grinned wider, its eyes void of anything human. What are you?" Ethan stammered, his voice barely audible over the pounding in his ears. "I am you," the doppelganger replied, its tone dripping with malice. "I am every fear, every regret, every shadow you tried to escape." The cavern began to shift again, the walls pulsating as if the house itself was feeding on the moment. Ethan felt a sharp pain in his chest, like invisible hands were reaching inside him, tearing at something unseen. "You can't fight it," the other Ethan hissed, stepping closer. The house doesn't let go. It shows you who you really are. The objects on the shelves began to hum, their ghostly glow intensifying. Ethan's eyes darted around the room, searching for a way out, but the only path was the staircase, and it had vanished. Then, without warning, the doppelganger lunged, its hands gripping Ethan's shoulders with unnatural strength. Images flooded Ethan's mind, memories twisted and darkened, moments from his life replayed with horrifying distortions. His childhood home in flames, his reflection in the mirror grinning back at him with blood-stained teeth, a faceless crowd watching as he screamed for help. "Stop!" Ethan cried, his voice cracking. "You're not real!" The doppelganger's grip tightened, its grin fading into a sneer. "Real enough to keep you here," it spat. Unless what?" Ethan demanded, his voice desperate. The figure leaned closer, its breath icy against Ethan's face. "Unless you give the house what it wants." Ethan's mind raced. "What does it want?" The doppelganger laughed, a chilling, hollow sound that echoed endlessly. "A soul," it said. "Yours, or another's." Ethan felt the floor beneath him begin to crumble, the darkness below hungrily reaching for him. Cliffhanger. As the void threatened to swallow him, Ethan heard a sound, a knock from somewhere above, faint but unmistakable. Someone else had entered the house. Ethan froze, the sound of the knock reverberating through the cavernous space. The doppelganger released him, its twisted smile returning. "Looks like you're not alone," it whispered. "Lucky you." The oppressive darkness shifted, pulling back slightly, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed from above. Someone was walking through the house, their presence a fragile thread of hope. "Help!" Ethan screamed, his voice tearing through the silence. "I'm down here." The footsteps paused, then grew louder as they neared the staircase that had reappeared. Ethan's pulse quickened, but the doppelganger chuckled darkly. "They won't save you," it said. "They'll only make it worse." The figure descending the staircase came into view. A woman, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. She appeared cautious but determined, her eyes scanning the room. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan staggered forward. "Please, you have to help me," he cried, his voice hoarse. The woman's flashlight landed on him, and her eyes widened in shock. "What happened to you?" Before Ethan could answer, the whispers surged again, wrapping around the room like a suffocating mist. The woman gasped, clutching her head as the voices grew louder. "Another one!" they hissed. "Another soul to claim!" The doppelganger stepped forward, its face now flickering between Ethan's and something far more monstrous. "She's yours to save," it said, its tone mocking, "but only if you're willing to give her what the house demands." Ethan's stomach churned as the reality sank in. If he wanted to escape, it would come at a price he wasn't sure he could pay. The woman dropped to her knees, her flashlight clattering to the floor as the darkness closed in around her. She looked up at Ethan, her expression pleading. "Please, help me." Cliffhanger. Ethan turned to the doppelganger, who held out a hand, its grin widening. "The choice is yours," it whispered. "Her soul or yours. Decide. Now." Ethan's mind raced, his heart hammering as the doppelganger's words echoed in his ears. Her soul or yours. The woman's eyes filled with terror, and she clutched at his arm, her grip icy and desperate. "I don't want to die," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the relentless whispers swirling around them. Ethan's throat tightened. Every instinct screamed at him to save himself, but the weight of the decision crushed him. Could he live with himself if he sacrificed her? The doppelganger loomed closer, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the floor. "Tick-tock, Ethan," it taunted. "The house doesn't wait." Ethan clenched his fists, sweat dripping down his face. His eyes darted to the shelves of glowing objects. Each one, he realized, represented someone who had been trapped here before, people who had made their own desperate choices. "I won't play your game," Ethan said through gritted teeth. The doppelganger tilted its head, amusement flickering across its grotesque face. "You think you have a choice? The house feeds, Ethan. You can't leave unless it's satisfied." The whispers grew deafening, and the floor trembled beneath them. The void in the cracks widened, its black tendrils creeping toward Ethan and the woman. "Decide," the doppelganger roared, its voice splitting into multiple tones, each more horrifying than the last. Ethan's eyes locked with the woman's. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she begged. The void's pull grew stronger, its cold grip tugging at Ethan's feet. He had only seconds left. Then, an idea struck him. He turned to the doppelganger, his voice steady despite the chaos. "If the house feeds on souls, then take both of us, but you'll starve if we escape together." The doppelganger faltered, its grin faltering for the first time. "You wouldn't dare." Ethan grabbed the woman's hand and lunged toward the void. The moment their feet left the crumbling floor, a piercing scream filled the air. The house shook violently, its walls cracking and splintering as the whispers turned to anguished wails. They plunged into the darkness, but instead of falling endlessly, they landed hard on cold, damp ground. Ethan gasped, his chest heaving. He was outside, lying on the overgrown path leading to Grant Manor. The woman was beside him, pale but alive. The house loomed silently in the distance, its windows dark and empty once more. "Did we make it?" the woman asked, her voice shaky. Ethan stared at the house, its silhouette fading into the night as a chilling whisper drifted on the wind. "For now," it said. Sophie had always been drawn to old bookstores, the kind that smelled of aged paper and forgotten stories. On a rainy afternoon, she wandered into a narrow shop tucked between two crumbling buildings. The bell above the door jingled softly as she entered, and an elderly man behind the counter gave her a nod before returning to his dusty ledger. The shelves were cluttered with books in various states of decay, their spines cracked, their titles barely legible. Sophie traced her fingers along the rows until she came across a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was embossed with an intricate pattern of vines and thorns, and the edges of the pages were darkened with age. The moment she picked it up, a chill ran through her. It felt heavier than it should, as if it carried a weight beyond its physical form. Opening it, she found its pages blank, save for one sentence scrawled in elegant handwriting on the first page. "Write, and it will come true." Intrigued, Sophie brought the diary to the counter. The shopkeeper's eyes widened when he saw it, and his hand trembled slightly as he placed it in a brown paper bag. "Be careful with that," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. At home, the storm outside raged as Sophie sat at her desk, the diary open before her. She hesitated, the pen hovering over the page. What would she write? She decided to test it with something small and harmless. "I wish for a red rose to appear on my desk," she wrote. Nothing happened at first. She chuckled nervously, feeling foolish, but then her lamp flickered and the air grew cold. A faint rustling sound came from behind her. Turning slowly, her breath caught in her throat. A single red rose lay on her desk, fresh and glistening with dew. Cliffhanger. Sophie's shock turned to dread as she noticed something else. A dark stain spreading across the diary's pages, forming words that she hadn't written. "The price will be paid." Sophie stared at the words seeping across the page. "The price will be paid." Her hands trembled as she slammed the diary shut, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at the rose, its petals vibrant yet unsettling in their perfection. This couldn't be real. She told herself it was a coincidence, a trick of the mind, but doubt lingered. To calm herself, she decided to test it again, something harmless, something mundane. "I wish for tomorrow's rain to stop by morning," she wrote cautiously. Nothing happened immediately, but the storm outside seemed to quiet for a moment, almost as if acknowledging her request. Sophie chuckled nervously. "It's just my imagination." The next morning, she woke to an eerie silence. Pulling back the curtains, she saw the sun shining brightly, the streets dry as if the storm had never happened. A lump formed in her throat. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from her friend Emma. "That storm last night was wild. Can't believe it just vanished like that." Sophie's chest tightened. 2 wishes, both granted. The diary wasn't a coincidence. It was real. But what did the warning mean? What was the price? Determined to uncover more, she returned to the bookstore. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, but the shop was empty. No sign of the old man or his dusty ledger. She wandered the aisles, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" On the counter, where the man had stood the day before, she found a slip of yellowed paper with a single line written in the same elegant handwriting. "What is given must be taken." A cold dread settled over her. She rushed home and threw the diary into a drawer, vowing never to open it again. That night, she was jolted awake by a loud banging. She sat up, her eyes adjusting to the dark. The drawer where she'd hidden the diary was wide open. The journal lay on her desk, its pages fluttering as though caught in a breeze. Cliffhanger? Words began to scrawl themselves across the blank pages in real time, as if written by an invisible hand. "You cannot run from what you've begun." Sophie's blood ran cold as she watched the words etch themselves onto the diary's pages. The writing was smooth, deliberate, and eerily graceful. Her heart raced, every instinct screaming at her to run, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. "Stop this," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I didn't ask for this." The pen on her desk lifted, floating in the air as though gripped by an invisible hand. It hovered over the diary before scrawling another line. "The deal is made. The debt will grow." She lunged for the pen, but it dropped lifelessly to the floor before she could grab it. The room grew colder, and Sophie could feel something watching her, something she couldn't see but knew was there. She slammed the diary shut and backed away. Her breath fogged the air as she whispered to herself, "It's just a book. It's just a book." But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The whispers began soon after, faint and indistinct, like the murmurs of a distant crowd. At first, they were easy to ignore, but as the night wore on, they grew louder, more insistent, forming fragmented sentences that made no sense. Write, see, the truth. Unable to take it anymore, Sophie grabbed the diary and hurled it into the fireplace. Flames roared to life, consuming the leather cover and curling its pages to ash. Relief flooded her, and for the first time in hours, she felt a sense of peace. But the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder. Her phone buzzed and she snatched it up, desperate for a distraction. It was a text from an unknown number. "You cannot destroy what binds you." Her hands shook as she stared at the message. Slowly, she turned back to the fireplace. The flames had died down, but the diary was there, intact, sitting atop the embers as if untouched by fire. Its cover gleamed, its vines and thorns seeming more intricate, more alive. Cliffhanger, the diary flipped open on its own, and new words appeared. "Next, you will write to save yourself, or lose everything." Sophie stumbled back from the fireplace, her breathing shallow as she watched the diary's pages ripple on their own, words bleeding across the paper. The debt grows. Balance must be restored. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, but she couldn't shake the sense that she was trapped, bound to the diary in ways she couldn't understand. Suddenly, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a photo, a picture of her mother sitting alone in their family home, smiling at the camera. The caption beneath it read, "She's safe, for now." "No," Sophie whispered, her throat tightening. She grabbed the diary, her voice trembling with desperation. "Leave her out of this. What do you want from me?" The pages turned rapidly, stopping on a blank one. The pen lifted from her desk again and scrawled, "Write to protect her. A sacrifice is required." Her hands shook as she picked up the pen. "What kind of sacrifice?" she asked, though she feared the answer. The words appeared instantly. "You must give up a memory, something precious, something you hold dear." Sophie felt tears sting her eyes. She thought of her mother, their shared laughter, their quiet mornings together. Could she give up a piece of that? Her gaze fell on the diary. She didn't have a choice. The whispers grew louder, the air colder, pressing against her like invisible walls. "Fine," she choked out, gripping the pen tightly. She began to write, "I wish to forget the summer we spent by the lake." The ink glistened on the page for a moment before it sank in, vanishing completely. A sharp pain lanced through Sophie's head, and she fell to her knees, clutching her temples. When the pain subsided, her mind felt hollow, like a part of her had been carved away. She tried to recall the lake, the warmth of the sun, her mother's laughter, but the memory was gone, leaving only a void. The diary's pages fluttered again, and new words appeared. "The first price is paid, but the house always collects more." Cliffhanger. Sophie's phone buzzed with another photo, this time of her best friend standing in her apartment, unaware of the shadow creeping up behind her. "She's next," the caption read. Sophie's fingers trembled as she stared at the photo of her best friend, Lily, standing obliviously in her dimly lit apartment. The shadow creeping up behind her was no ordinary darkness. It was dense, twisting, almost alive. "No!" Sophie shouted, grabbing her phone. She dialed Lily's number, her heart pounding in her chest. The line rang once, twice, then clicked. "Hey, Soph!" Lily's cheerful voice came through. "What's up?" "Lily, listen to me," Sophie said urgently. "You need to get out of your apartment right now." There was a pause, followed by a nervous laugh. "What? Why? What's going on?" "Just trust me," Sophie pleaded. "There's something dangerous in your apartment. Please, just leave." Before Lily could respond, a low, guttural growl echoed faintly through the call, sending chills down Sophie's spine. "Sophie?" Lily's voice wavered. "What was that?" Sophie gripped the diary, her mind racing. "Stay on the phone with me. Head to the door. Don't look back." Lily's footsteps echoed through the phone as she moved quickly, her breath growing ragged. "Okay, I'm at the door." A sudden crash erupted through the line, followed by Lily's scream. The call went dead. "No, no, no!" Sophie cried, redialing, but the line was busy. Desperation clawed at her. She turned to the diary, flipping it open. "I'll do anything. Just don't hurt her," she yelled. The pen lifted once more, gliding over the page with eerie precision. "Then you know the cost." Sophie swallowed hard, tears streaming down her face. "What do you want this time?" The response came swiftly. "A bond must break. Sever a connection, and she will be spared." She hesitated, dread washing over her. "A bond?" The diary answered. "Someone you love. Forget them, and the shadow will withdraw." Sophie's heart shattered. The stakes were rising, and the diary wasn't done with her yet. Her mind raced through her relationships. She thought of Lily, her mother, the people who kept her grounded. She couldn't lose Lily, but could she bear to erase another person from her life? Cliffhanger. Sophie gritted her teeth and began to write, but before her pen touched the page, a voice whispered from the shadows behind her. "You're running out of time." Sophie whipped around, but there was nothing behind her except the flickering shadows cast by her desk lamp. Her pulse thundered in her ears as the diary's pages fluttered, urging her forward. She glanced at her phone. No new messages, no missed calls. The image of Lily and the encroaching shadow was burned into her mind. Time was slipping through her fingers. With a shaking hand, she gripped the pen and hovered over the page. "I'll do it," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'll break a bond. Just let her live." The pen moved on its own, carving a single word into the page. Name. Sophie's chest tightened. She thought of her mother, her childhood best friend, Lily. Each connection a lifeline in the storm of her life. To erase one of them felt like tearing a piece of her soul away. Her mind drifted to her father, a man who had vanished from her life years ago, leaving only bitter memories. The thought felt cruel, but necessary. "If I have to lose someone," she murmured, "it'll be him." She pressed the pen to the page, her hand steady despite the chaos inside her. "I wish to forget my father," she wrote. The moment the words formed, the diary glowed faintly, and a cold wind swept through the room. Sophie felt a sharp, piercing pain in her chest, as if a piece of her heart had been ripped away. Then, silence. Her phone buzzed. Sophie snatched it up, relief flooding her when she saw a text from Lily. "I'm okay. I don't know what just happened, but I'm safe. Thank you." Sophie exhaled shakily, tears streaming down her face. It was over, at least for now. She looked back at the diary, its cover gleaming ominously, and slammed it shut. But the peace didn't last. The shadows in the room began to stir again, twisting and coiling like smoke. The whispers returned, more guttural and insistent. The pen lifted once more, writing a final, chilling message across the diary's cover. "One bond breaks, but the house always hungers for more." Cliffhanger. Sophie's lamp flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness as the sound of a second knock echoed from her front door. Sophie froze as the knock echoed through her apartment, sharp and deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat, and her eyes darted toward the front door. The whispers swirled around her, growing louder, more taunting. "Open it! Let the house in!" Her instinct screamed to stay put, but the knock came again, this time accompanied by a low, rasping voice. "Sophie," it called, dragging her name out like a caress. Gripping the diary tightly, she forced herself to stand. Her legs felt like lead as she crossed the room, each step heavy with dread. She reached the door and hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "Who's there?" she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Then the rasping voice replied, "You owe me." Sophie's blood ran cold. She yanked the door open, but the hallway beyond was empty, bathed in the sickly glow of a flickering light. She stepped back, her heart pounding, and slammed the door shut. When she turned, the diary was waiting for her on the coffee table, its pages open and blank, as though daring her to continue. The pen hovered above it, quivering. Suddenly, a deep guttural laugh filled the room, shaking the walls. Sophie clutched her head, the sound reverberating inside her skull. The shadows in the corners of the room began to take shape, tall, skeletal figures with hollow eyes and twisted grins. "You've fed us well," the voice growled, now coming from everywhere and nowhere. "But one final debt remains." The pen scrawled furiously across the diary's pages. "A soul for freedom. Yours or theirs." Sophie's knees buckled and she collapsed onto the floor. Her mind reeled with the weight of the choice. She could give herself up, end the nightmare, or pass the curse to someone else, to Lily, her mother, or a stranger. The skeletal figures closed in, their hollow eyes fixed on her. "Decide," they hissed, "or we'll decide for you." Tears streamed down Sophie's face as she reached for the pen, her hand trembling. She hesitated for a moment that felt like eternity before finally pressing the tip to the page. "I offer..." Cliffhanger. The room went deathly silent as Sophie's pen stopped mid-sentence. The diary's pages burst into flame, and the figures surged forward, their hollow eyes burning with hunger. It started as a typical late shift for Kara, a nurse in a small-town hospital. She was used to quiet nights filled with paperwork and the occasional groggy patient. But tonight, something felt different. The silence in the building was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic hum of fluorescent lights. Most of the patients were asleep, except for one, room 406. "Mr. Hall," Kara muttered, scanning his chart. He'd been in a coma for months, his body unresponsive but stable. There was nothing unusual about him except for the unnerving fact that his vitals occasionally spiked for no reason. The doctors had no explanation, and his family had stopped visiting. As Kara checked his monitors, she noticed something strange. His oxygen levels were dipping. She leaned in to adjust the mask when she froze. His eyes were open, her breath caught. Comatose patients didn't just wake up like this. His gaze was glassy, unfocused, but there was something behind those eyes, a flicker of awareness. "Mr. Hall," she whispered. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He struggled, his hands twitching, as if trying to speak. Kara leaned closer, her heart pounding. Finally, a hoarse whisper escaped. "Don't leave me alone." Kara staggered back, nearly tripping over the chair behind her. The monitors began to beep wildly, and Mr. Hall's body convulsed. She hit the call button, shouting for help, but the sound felt swallowed by the thick air. Suddenly, his body went still. The monitors flatlined, their shrill alarm echoing through the room. Kara stood frozen, her eyes locked on his pale, lifeless face. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind her. Cliffhanger. The lights flickered, and Kara turned to see Mr. Hall's reflection in the dark window. Standing, his face twisted in a silent scream. Kara's breath hitched as she stared at the reflection in the window. Mr. Hall, his body still lifeless on the bed, stood upright in the glass, his mouth agape in a silent, agonized scream. The room plunged into darkness as the lights flickered out completely. The only illumination came from the weak glow of the monitors, their steady hum now replaced by an eerie static. "Help!" a faint, guttural voice whispered. It wasn't coming from the bed. It was coming from the reflection. "Who's there?" Kara's voice quivered as she backed toward the door, her shaking hand fumbling for the handle. It wouldn't budge. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Don't leave me!" Kara's pulse thundered as she whipped around, the reflection gone. She flicked on her phone's flashlight, the beam trembling as she swept it across the room. Mr. Hall's body remained motionless on the bed, his pale face serene in the glow. Then the air shifted, a sudden bone-chilling cold that made her breath fog. The monitors screeched, their static giving way to a distorted voice. "They won't let me out?" The words sent a jolt of terror through her. "What do you mean? Who won't let you out?" Kara demanded, her voice shaky. The static warped, and for a moment, she thought she heard faint laughter, distant and cruel. A sharp bang echoed from the corner of the room, and Kara swung her flashlight toward the sound. The metal tray on the bedside table had fallen to the floor, the instruments scattered, but it wasn't the tray that made her blood run cold. It was the shadow stretching across the wall, long and spindly, moving toward her despite no visible source. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She fished it out, her hands trembling as she glanced at the screen. A single message glowed back at her. "He's still locked in. Free him, or you'll take his place." Cliffhanger. The shadow reached her feet, and Kara felt a cold hand grip her ankle, pulling her toward the bed. Kara screamed as the icy grip tightened around her ankle, dragging her toward the bed. She clawed at the floor, her flashlight spinning wildly, casting grotesque shapes across the walls. "Stop!" she cried, kicking desperately. The shadow rippled, its form shifting like smoke, but the grip remained firm. The voice from the monitors returned, clearer now, laced with desperation. "Help me! Before they take you!" Summoning all her strength, Kara twisted free and scrambled to her feet. Her ankle throbbed, but she didn't dare look down. The shadow recoiled slightly, hovering near the bed, its tendrils curling like fingers beckoning her closer. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The shadow seemed to swell, its edges darkening. Then, the monitors displayed something new. Heartbeats, dozens of them, overlapping in a frantic rhythm. "They're trapped," the voice whispered. "In the in-between. The door was opened, but it never closed." Kara's mind raced, her thoughts a jumble of fear and disbelief. "The in-between?" she echoed, her voice barely audible. Before she could process the words, the shadow darted toward the corner of the room, coiling around the emergency power panel. Sparks flew, and the room plunged into an unnatural silence, broken only by the faint hum of the static-filled monitors. The voice grew darker, more insistent. "You can set us free, or stay here forever." Kara's flashlight flickered, and the air grew heavier, pressing against her chest. The shadow reformed, taller now, almost humanoid, its face featureless, but its intent clear. "You have to unlock the door," it rasped. "Find the key." "I don't understand," Kara shouted, her panic rising. Suddenly the shadow surged forward, its form engulfing her. Images flooded her mind, cold corridors, screaming voices, a rusted door at the end of a long, dark hall. A key dangled from a chain, just out of reach. Cliffhanger, as the vision faded, Kara found herself standing in a different room, dark, cold, and empty. A single word was etched into the wall: choose. The icy air bit at Kara's skin as she stared at the word etched into the wall. Choose. The room was pitch black, except for a faint, pulsating light coming from a doorway ahead. The whispers returned, low and fragmented, coming from every direction. Her breathing quickened as she stepped cautiously toward the light. Each step echoed unnaturally, as though the room stretched endlessly beyond the boundaries of her sight. The doorway led to a long, narrow hall lined with tall mirrors. Their glass shimmered faintly, reflecting not only her, but twisted, shadowy figures that writhed and shifted behind her reflection. Kara froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The figures weren't just reflections, they were watching her. The voice from earlier rasped through the silence. "Every choice leaves a scar. Choose wisely, or the house will keep you." The pulsating light grew stronger, and Kara noticed something strange about the mirrors. In each one, her reflection stood still while the background changed, revealing scenes from her life. In one, she was a child, hiding under her bed, terrified of her father's drunken rage. In another, she saw herself as a teenager, her face streaked with tears after losing her best friend in a car accident. Then she came to a mirror that showed her now, standing alone in the hallway. But behind her, a rusted door appeared, and the key she'd seen earlier dangled from a hook above it. "This is the door," Kara whispered, her voice trembling. The whispers around her intensified, growing frantic and jarring. "Find the key, but beware the price." Before she could move, the shadowy figures in the mirrors surged forward, pressing against the glass, their faces distorted with anguish. One by one, the mirrors began to crack, spiderweb fractures spreading rapidly. Suddenly, a hand burst through the nearest mirror, clawing at the air. Kara stumbled back, her scream echoing through the hall as more hands emerged, reaching for her, their fingers sharp and bony. Cliffhanger. As the mirrors shattered, the hallway trembled, and the rusted door appeared in the distance, its handle slowly turning. Something on the other side was trying to get in. The rusted door loomed at the end of the hall, its handle twisting slowly, each creak sending chills down Kara's spine. The shattered mirrors behind her bled shadows, the figures within crawling out and clawing at the walls, their distorted faces locked in silent screams. "Get to the door!" the voice from the static hissed. "It's the only way." Kara's instinct screamed to run the other way, but the shadows closed in, leaving her no choice. She sprinted toward the door, her footsteps echoing as the ground seemed to shift beneath her. The closer she got, the colder the air became. Frost began to creep up the walls, and her breath fogged in front of her. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a deafening chorus. "Don't open it! Free us! Save yourself!" Kara reached the door and hesitated, her hand hovering over the icy handle. Her reflection shimmered in its rusted surface, but it wasn't hers. It was the shadowy figure from earlier, its hollow eyes fixed on her. She swallowed hard and reached for the key dangling above the door. The moment her fingers touched it, the hallway plunged into total darkness. A low growl rumbled behind her, and she felt the weight of something enormous moving in the shadows. "You're too late," the voice rasped, now filled with malevolent glee. Kara turned the key in the lock, her heart hammering. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing a blinding white void beyond. For a moment, she thought she'd escaped, but then she felt it, a hand gripping her shoulder, freezing her in place. "Not so fast," the guttural voice snarled. She was yanked backward, her body slamming into the cold, hard ground. The shadows surged past her, flooding into the open door like a torrent of ink, their shrieks deafening. As the last shadow disappeared into the void, the door began to close, its edges glowing hot like molten metal. Kara scrambled to her feet, but the hand holding her tightened, its claws digging into her skin. Cliffhanger. She turned to face her captor and froze in horror. It was her own reflection, its lips curling into a sinister smile as it whispered, "Now you're the one locked in." Kara's mind reeled as she stared into the eyes of her twisted reflection, its grin unnervingly wide. The grip on her shoulder tightened, its nails biting into her skin as if to anchor her in place. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "This isn't real." "Oh, it's very real," the reflection sneered. Its voice was hers, but distorted, lower, colder, a perfect mimicry tainted with malice. "You open the door, now the house gets what it wants." The door behind her groaned, its rusted surface now glowing faintly with eerie symbols. The last of the shadows had vanished into the void, but the air was still thick with their whispers. "What do you mean?" Kara demanded, her heart racing. The reflection leaned closer, its hollow eyes narrowing. "The house keeps the balance. Someone must always stay behind." "No!" Kara yanked free, her hand brushing against the key still in the lock. "I didn't agree to this." Her reflection tilted its head, its grin fading into a look of dark amusement. "You made the choice the moment you stayed." The hallway trembled violently, and the walls began to crack, revealing endless darkness beyond. The door started to close, its light dimming, as if it were sealing her fate. Desperation surged through Kara. She grabbed the edge of the door, pulling against its immense weight, the key burning hot in her other hand. "If someone has to stay, it won't be me." The reflection laughed, the sound echoing like breaking glass. "Too late, you've been marked." Kara's gaze snapped to her hand, where dark veins began to crawl up her arm, spreading like ink under her skin. Panic clawed at her throat. She couldn't let it end like this. With a scream, she wrenched the key free and thrust it toward the reflection. The moment it touched the figure's chest, the hallway exploded with blinding light. Cliffhanger. When the light faded, Kara found herself standing in the middle of a hospital room, her own body lying lifeless on the bed. But when she turned to the mirror, her reflection was gone. Something else had taken her place. Kara's heart thudded in her chest as she stared at her lifeless body on the hospital bed. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the room, a cruel reminder of her tether to the physical world. But when she turned to the mirror on the wall, she saw nothing. No reflection, just an empty frame staring back at her. "Is this death?" she whispered, her voice echoing faintly in the sterile room. The shadows in the corners of the room began to writhe, stretching toward her. She stepped back instinctively, her hands trembling. "No!" a voice rasped behind her. She spun around only to see her reflection stepping out of the mirror, now fully formed. Its features were eerily familiar, yet grotesquely twisted. Its smile too wide, its eyes hollow and glinting with malice. "You're not dead," it continued, its tone mocking. "You're just locked in." "Why?" Kara demanded, her voice rising with panic. "Why me?" The reflection tilted its head, feigning curiosity. "The house doesn't care who. It just needs someone to hold the door open." Kara clenched her fists, fury bubbling beneath her fear. "I'll find a way out. You won't keep me here." The reflection's laugh was sharp and piercing. "You think you're the first to say that?" It stepped closer, its voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "The house always wins. You're its prisoner now. But don't worry, someone else will stumble in eventually, just like you did." The shadowy tendrils from the corners of the room slithered toward her, coiling around her wrists and ankles. Kara struggled, but the shadows pulled her back toward the mirror, which now shimmered like liquid glass. "No!" she screamed, her voice cracking as her body was dragged closer. "You'll wait," the reflection said coldly, stepping aside to let her pass. "Just like I did." With one last pull, the shadows yanked her through the mirror. She hit the other side with a cold, crushing silence. The glass solidified behind her, trapping her in a dark, endless void. From the other side, her reflection leaned forward, now fully in control. It smoothed its stolen features, smiling as it turned to face the hospital room. Cliffhanger. The door to the room creaked open, and a nurse entered, oblivious to the change. The reflection, now Kara, smiled warmly and said, "Good evening. Everything's fine here."